Darwin's theory of evolution implicitly assumes that any change is possible. Any biological species can become any biological species given enough time. Humans may have evolved from fish-like creatures over millions of years through a series of intermediates, and we might evolve back into fish-like creatures given enough time. That's what evolution at its core accepts. But that raises a question: is that consistent with what we observe? And Darwin even alluded to the potential for this. He gave a test for evolution in his book on the origin of species, saying, and I think I've got the quote pretty close, if it can be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So it's a mouthful of Victorian English, but his point is, evolution doesn't happen in big leaps. Evolutionists would say, for example, birds evolved from dinosaurs. They would say the way it happened was not Tyrannosaurus rex laid an egg and out popped a toucan. It was a slow, gradual, step by step over millions of years, dinosaurs slowly acquiring the precursor to feathers and then more feathers, and it takes a long time. Numerous slight modifications. So literally the devil's in the details then for evolution. Now, creationists are often criticized for quoting that sentence from Darwin because they say, well, you have to read the next sentence, which is Darwin says, I can think of no such case. In theory, this is how you could refute evolution, but there's no example like this on the planet. Now, Darwin was, and all of his contemporaries, were entirely ignorant of genetics and of the structure of the cell and of the biochemistry of the cell and of the world of complex interdependent interactions that happen within inside each of us. And so 150 years later, we can now go back and revisit his test, because evolution, in ways he never anticipated, happens at the genetic level. It happens at the cellular level, because that's what's inherited, and that's, if you're going to have numerous successive slight modifications, you got to change DNA and do it little tiny step at a time. Well, we now know there are cellular structures like the blood clotting cascade. They can be physiological, they can be cellular. There's various levels where you've got numerous interacting components. You remove one component, the system collapses. Well, Darwin's book on the origin of species is, part of that title is By Means of Natural Selection. What's natural selection? Survival of the fittest to reproduce. In a nutshell, there has to be some function, something beneficial, something advantageous for nature to select for this process to operate. So now let's apply that in cellular terms, physiological terms. We've got a functioning system, like blood clotting or so forth. There's multiple components. If you remove one, the system collapses. Well, how are you going to evolve? Let's say there's 8 different components. Each of these 8 different components, if the system doesn't function until all 8 are in place, how are you going to select for this piece number 1 if there's 8 when it does nothing by itself? That's the challenge then, and I would argue the falsification of evolution. There are structures natural selection cannot evolve. Now, of course, the evolutionary community has not taken too kindly to this, and they will repeatedly state it's been refuted. But in my experience, all of these supposed refutations fall into basically 4 or 5 categories. They'll appeal to things we do on the farm, artificial selection as support. Well, look at what farmers have been, look at the 850 plus horse and donkey breeds we've been able to produce. Massive diversity. What do you mean natural selection can't do it? Well, what's the problem with that analogy between selection on the farm, artificial selection, and natural selection? This one has intelligence, this one does not. So that breaks down as well. They might say, well, we haven't figured out the details yet, but there's still sort of you can find a simple blood clotting cascade and a more complex one. There's this hierarchy that seems to suggest inheritance from a common ancestor, a simple one that became more complex with time. That misses Darwin's test as well. His point was not, his test of evolution was not, if you can find a structure of life that doesn't fit simple to complex. His point was, if you step by step cannot build this. So just saying, well, there's this pattern, that doesn't answer the question. It changes the subject, essentially. Some have said, well, back to the analogy of human design, bridges have a lot of interacting components and really aren't functional until it all comes together in the end. Otherwise, it's a bridge for a road, it's going to crash in the ocean, crash in a river, you name it. So humans erect scaffolds to buttress and uphold these unstable intermediate states, and then we remove them at the end. You never see a trace, and the thing functions. So the answer to this challenge is evolution found ways to erect scaffolds to support piece number 1 of the blood clotting cascade, piece number 2, until the final thing came together, then they disappeared. And of course, the problem with that analogy is, number 1, it's intelligence in the bridge building example, and there's no intelligence in nature. And secondly, they're giving an explanation which by definition leaves no trace. So we can't even test it. The fourth thing they might appeal to is they'll say neutral evolution. Basically, well, maybe it's not selection. In essence, neutral evolution is dumb luck. Put it this way, evolutionists frequently object to creationists saying, well, the probability of evolution is exceedingly low. Well, now they say natural selection is not random. That's true. It's a non-random interaction. But as soon as they say neutral evolution, now we're back to dumb luck. And we can calculate the probability, and it's basically impossible, statistically impossible. So to summarize, Darwin gave a test of evolution that he really couldn't evaluate in 1859 because he didn't know the inner workings of the cell. He did not have access to where evolution actually happens in the cell, in the genetic code. Now that we have access to this, we can say there are structures, there are systems that have all these components that interact. You pull one out, it collapses. You can't evolve that step by tiny step. By selection, you can't evolve that by dumb luck because it's impossible. In essence, we can now say strongly, there are things in nature for which evolution cannot possibly be the explanation. It is a broken theory. We have to come up with something else.